Welcome back, everybody. We are set to begin the second unit, and a part of that unit is a series of talks about the West. Let's get an introduction to the unit. While the developing United States debated and then fought over slavery and if the states should allow it, the frontier continued to push west throughout and beyond. People moved west, farmed the land, and the nation connected from east to west. Meanwhile, American Indians continued to be pushed west and, as land became more scarce for Americans, quartered into small plots of land. And this part of Unit 2 has 4 subjects. Again, today we are looking at American Indians under pressure, and then we move on to 3 other subtopics as we move forward. So let's dive into our first subtopic, American Indians under pressure. Be sure to check out the vocabulary words as you see here. Reservation, American Indian Wars. So keep in mind that's a series of wars, not just a single war. And then assimilated, and you may see that as assimilate or assimilation. And then the Dawes Act is how we round out vocabulary. And for this topic, let's go ahead and get some historical background. The first thing mentioned here are the failed relationships that happened early on in the history of the United States, but during colonial times when the English are colonizing the Americas, at least where the United States ends up taking shape. They practice societies of exclusion, not inclusion. What this means is instead of English settlers and American Indians developing and forming relationships and their societies kind of intermingling, they remain separated. It helps fuel or keep some of the animosity that exists between them because of land and the animosity that's created because of the land encroachment of the English. Manifest destiny is an idea that takes form in the early to mid 1800s, and throughout U.S. history, the colonies and people have continued to push westward, and we see that at this present time in our historical in class, at this historical time in class, the late 1800s. But manifest destiny was this idea that God intended this for the United States to keep pushing westward and keep finding that new frontier and then settling it. The third item on here is forced relocation, and this is once again, it's throughout American, United States history, but also during colonial times, is the land that, if you will, belongs to American Indians, well, that they keep being removed from their lands as settlers, and then Americans continue to push westward. We see that in general. We see that in some very specific circumstances. And then we're going to see that once again in this period from 1865 to 1900. Why are American Indians being pushed west, and why has that continued to happen during this later 1800s time period? And one of the reasons is the Homestead Act, but it's also just the ideas behind the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act is intended, it's a program put in place by the government where it encourages people to move out west, giving them farmland, 160 acres of farmland, and as long as they stay there for a while and farm the land, then they get this plot of land for free. So that's encouraging people to move out. And as mentioned, you already have ideas that Americans are supposed to push the frontier and move west and manifest destiny. And now here's a government policy that's encouraging the same type of thing. Things like the railroads are actually allowing for that to take place and happen. Along with this type of movement is a question that is asked, if you will, during the time, and that is, what do you do about the American Indians? What do you do with them? Which is a very harsh way of looking at a group of people. What do you do with them? Because they are considered to be getting in the way. So one of the ideas that comes around in the early mid 1800s are reservations, and that you can go ahead and the government will create these reservation lands, and that's where you put American Indians. And some of the language there should sound kind of harsh, because that's exactly what the government is doing. Is it's not consulting, it's not drawing up contracts that are legitimate, fair, if you will, and then respected after the contract is in place. It's simply go there. It's telling them to go there and be there, even though those aren't their original lands. Okay, then the buffalo population. This gives a little bit of insight as to how destructive things could be, or were at times for white Americans moving west. And that is, the buffalo population used to roam almost from coast to coast in what we now know as the United States. But the buffalo population takes an absolutely huge hit during the mid to late 1800s, just because of sport. You'd have individuals even just riding on train, and from the trains they would see buffalo and then shoot buffalo. And of course, at that point, they are not going to retrieve the buffalo to use their hide or use the buffalo for their meat and all. They simply leave the buffalo to rot and die. So the sport and the lack of care of buffalo is something that happens during this time, which is important to note because of the Plains American Indians and how much they rely on the buffalo for so many of their things that they use, including teepees, which is how they use the buffalo hides. I won't spend much time diving into this map, but I would encourage you to do so. It's a map of American Indian land that is lost in this 40-year period, and actually greater than 40-year period. And then you see the creation of the reservations. Pay attention to what looks like westward movement. It is certainly there. It then dates as far as when reservations are created. Then a couple of lowlights from the American Indian Wars that occur in the later 1800s, this kind of roughly this 1865 to 1900 period. But you see here the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, Battle of Little Bighorn 1876, Wounded Knee in 1890. It's important to note to distinct each of these as a separate event. Who they impact is important to note because it is different American Indian nations that are impacted, possibly each time, and each of them here, it impacts different American Indian nations. But then it's a long continuation of really rebellion or resistance. Resistance is the better word here. It's the long-term resistance of American Indian nations to white encroachment, American government encroachment on lands. And I say encroachment on lands, but at times it also can just be violence. So we see that with the Sand Creek Massacre. We see that with Battle of Little Bighorn and then Wounded Knee as well. But there are more American Indian wars that take place. Here's just what it shows here is certainly you can see how long a period that the American Indian Wars take shape. Here's another map of the western United States, west of the Mississippi River mostly. And in this particular map, pay attention to, once again, the American Indian reservations and the fact that here's what's in place by 1890. But since it is a map about the American Indian Wars, you see some of the locations where there was some sort of significant conflict between either U.S. settlers or U.S. Soldiers or U.S. government in some other way, and particular American Indian nations. Just to dive in a little bit deeper with the American Indian Wars, on the left, you see a set of conflicts that occur. You can go back on the slideshow to check out the map and compare it to this. There is a lot of carryover from conflicts that were on the map to conflicts on the left-hand column here. And then you see the outcome of these conflicts and what they were on the right. A couple of conclusions that can be drawn from this time period. The first is we see the United States prior to this period, during this period, and then in the future, we see the United States government making policy changes on what to do with the American Indian. Again, very, if you will, very harsh language, but they are considered a problem to whites and the U.S. government. So they are the ones, the U.S. government, they are the ones who are determining the fate in many ways of different and all American Indian nations. For example, putting them onto reservations and then later focusing on assimilation. The Dawes Act is another takeaway, which we haven't really discussed yet. It is a vocabulary term. But the Dawes Act, or the Dawes General Allotment Act, this is an example of assimilation taking place. And it ties in nicely with the first conclusion, that of a policy change that the government has, even those that are well-intentioned whites trying to do something for the native population. It's still requiring American Indians to remove their own culture and adopt somebody else's culture. So those are a couple of big takeaways for this subsection. That's it for this lesson. We'll see you next time.